Thank you so much. It's really a huge honor to be here and wonderful to talk about preprinting in the context of our kind of broader publication culture and some of the changes that have been happening recently in the life sciences. So I think Danny has set this up really beautifully that, we believe that science is this collaborative endeavor, and of course it is. All findings are being built off of previous discoveries, and in kind of the grand scheme of things, we are actually working together to discover new knowledge. But from the perspective of an individual researcher, especially an early career researcher, it can often feel like more of a Hunger Games style tournament model where we're struggling to meet pay lines that leave us with funding rates at grant agencies in the low teens that are pitting hundreds of applicants against one another for jobs. And really the environment has been described as hyper-competitive, which is not conducive to the kind of open sharing and the ideals that we would like to see in science. But one thing that I think is important to consider is that there are characteristics which are beneficial both to the practice of science and individual scientists, which is, one of those is, of course, the overall speed of science. And I think this is an area that paradoxically we're almost losing out on. So the amount of data that goes into a paper today in 3 of the kind of major journals in cell biology. This is a graph from Ron Vale, the founder of ASAPbio, and you can find here that essentially over this 30-year period, the number of panels has increased more than doubled in the manuscripts themselves, and of course there's also this additional supplemental information now. So all the experiments, the number of experiments that researchers must do to put a manuscript together is actually increasing. And grad students at UCSF, he also found, are also taking a longer time to put together their first author publication. And I think that, there's multiple reasons for this. One could certainly speculate, but I think it's clear that the journal in which these young scientists are publishing in is intrinsically going to be tied to how they're going to be evaluated, what types of postdoc positions they can get, what type of fellowships they can get. And therefore, I know many of people are basically holding on to their results, trying to make a complete story for publishing in a high impact journal. And so if we could somehow break apart this linkage between releasing the information and evaluating the information, then the whole practice of science could go faster. And of course, I won't belabor the point of preprints because they've come up many times before, and they're absolutely widespread in other areas, including, of course, the archive, over a quarter century old, with a really robust culture of preprinting. And I think the major benefit of preprinting is really to expose to a community of researchers the knowledge contained in a paper months or potentially even years before it comes out as a final publication. And I think there's clearly a complementary value of this peer-reviewed publication in the sense that this has this sort of expert validation, it has some stamp of quality, if you like, that is incredibly valuable, especially as papers are evaluated outside of a small community of experts. But for people who are evaluating individual papers for their own research, I certainly want to know as soon as any new information on my research topic is available. I want to know immediately. And likewise, for early career researchers who are applying for a postdoc position, applying for a job, applying for a fellowship, being able to demonstrate their work earlier, this time frame of months or years can really make a difference between being able to demonstrate accurately the progress that we've made versus dropping out of science altogether in some cases. So that speed is really critical. And I think, in addition to the speed, the fact that these things are a part of a permanent scientific record, not an ephemeral blog post or something that you stick on Facebook, but something that is actually citable so that it can actually enter into this kind of scholarly knowledge. So with this awareness that there are all of these potential benefits of preprints, and yet kind of a lack of really robust culture of preprints. ASAPbio kind of emerged out of this organization called Rescuing Biomedical Research. So Ron Vale recruited a couple of other us who are in this organization, which actually was focused on addressing some of these systemic problems in the way research is basically funded, incentivized, et cetera. And we organized a meeting bringing together a variety of stakeholders, funders, people from journals, publishers, researchers at the beginning and later in their careers, to kind of talk about what role preprints could play. And over time, we've really seen a remarkable growth in preprints. So this is essentially the same graph that Danny showed. Now it's being maintained monthly by Jordan and Naya, who wrote a very excellent search engine, PubMed. So this data is also from his search engine. And what you can see here is that over time, there has been a quantitative biology section of the archive for many years. And of course, it still has a loyal following. That's in red here. And there were some previous efforts to get preprints going in the life sciences. Actually, well before this chart, in the 1960s, there was an NIH experiment called information exchange groups, which were essentially physical preprint servers. You would send in your manuscript on paper, they would basically photocopy it, and then physically mail it out to everyone else on the list. And they're actually very successful and grew to a point where it became kind of impractical to deal with the large numbers of boxes of papers. So it sort of collapsed under its own weight in a sense. And of course, there was an attempt around 2000 with Harold Varmus starting what eventually became PubMed Central as and in that original proposal, that was essentially a preprint server, which was sort of changed over the course of its life by pressure from entities that saw it as a threat to their business model. But really, in recent years, with the emergence of bioRxiv and PureJ preprints in 2013, a culture of preprinting the life sciences has really kind of started to take off. And I think you've seen this slide like 3 times before, so I won't belabor it except to say that in addition to the fact that there are new preprint servers arriving basically on the scene almost every week. For example, medRxiv was just discussed at the Peer Review Congress last week. earthArchive is also relatively new. That in addition to preprint servers appearing frequently, that we're seeing not only disciplinary preprint servers and the announcement but also groups that are representing kind of regions. For example, Indonesia, there's an Indonesian archive with researchers from that country. So some of these have not yet launched, but I think there's a broad interest in many areas. And this has been really driven by the leadership of funders, as you've already heard, but also by the removal of barriers at journals. I think under researcher request, a lot of journals that have previously been resistant to preprinting have allowed preprints and changed their policies. And I think one particularly exciting element for researchers is the fact that not only are journals okay with preprints, but they're actually in some cases recruiting papers from preprint servers. So this is something that I hear quite a lot anecdotally. People tweeting here, for example, journals contact us regarding the publication of our bioRxiv paper. We received submission invitations. So this actually happened to one of my preprints earlier this year, and it like completely made me and my co-authors month because it totally flips this common anxiety of who's going to like my paper, what's the right audience, is this even a good editorial match, and kind of makes this matchmaking a bit more efficient. So preprint servers are really a potential marketplace for editorial selection. So this is an interesting project from Academic Karma where effectively they're contacting the authors of preprints and bioRxiv and asking them if they have submitted to a journal yet, and if they have not, then they can get listed on this sort of resource, which also provides the date and metric scores in the area, and potentially is a way to identify unsubmitted preprints. And PLOS Genetics has kind of done something really significant, which is to essentially appoint 3 preprint editors to formalize this process. These editors are charged with basically identifying preprints and inviting their submission to the journal. So you've already, I think Louise already showed you essentially this information yesterday, but really we're still in the infancy of preprinting in the life sciences, despite all of these exciting policy changes. And it's something that I think is really easy to forget if you just look at Twitter. So on Twitter, I think there's this real sort of bubble where everyone is talking about preprints. It's really sort of a household word. But that is definitely not the case going into a research institution. Like, for example, I often, if I'm talking at just people who are interested in open science, they clearly know what a preprint is. But if I go into a required responsible conduct of research course, which is a NIH-mandated training program for postdocs, and ask them how many of you know what a preprint is, probably only 10% are aware. So I think there's still a long way to go in terms of the awareness of what preprints even are. And we don't just want to improve the number of preprints or increase the number of preprints because, what we're ultimately trying to do is advance the communication of science rather than this particular mechanism. And furthermore, we want to ensure that whatever number of preprints are posted, that those preprints are sort of adhering to what the community would consider best practices in terms of access, screening, preservation. We heard some allusions earlier to kind of unintended consequences. If there's a preprint server that's not screening content whatsoever, you could imagine that ethical breaches of privacy could reveal information that could discredit the server, that could cause damage. And I think this is important not only for kind of public opinion, but also making sure that this preprint server is a place where researchers actually want to deposit their content. I think that if there is a huge amount of kind of non-scientific or irrelevant content that is appearing on these servers, that it will kind of create sort of like a broken window syndrome where people will be less likely to want to post their preprints there. So I think finding out this situation of how can we increase the number of preprints, how can we embrace some of the new uses of preprints, for example, of posting negative results, perhaps posting material that will not become a journal article. For example, you could imagine that a single figure has a lot of scientific validity, would be very helpful to be communicated to the community, but these things could become valuable preprints even if they're not destined for a journal. So I think the question of how do we increase the adoption of preprints is one that relies heavily on the culture, which it's really complicated, and you aren't able to see at all, but there are arrows connecting all of these. Let's see if I can, what is this? Okay, well, you see this pointer? No. Okay, so in a counterclockwise fashion, you can imagine that there's a connection between these features here. So this is a framework from the UK Cabinet Office Strategy Unit, which I find very helpful for thinking about the cultural change issues surrounding preprints. So the kind of thesis is that behaviors are driven by, of course, values and beliefs, which determine whether people will decide to want to take some sort of action. But even if they make that decision, that is, if they set this behavioral intention, then kind of external behavioral drivers, so incentives, will modulate their willingness to do something. Once they've selected a behavioral path, the obstacles that they might encounter along that path can modulate whether or not they actually perform that behavior. And of course, over time, this accumulation of behaviors into a norm can feed back onto the idea of what is valuable and important for a culture. So to kind of map onto this framework some of the challenges in the road of preprint adoption, I think this idea that preprints are not the norm at all is actually a huge obstacle in the sense that not only do few people know about preprints, but this lack of awareness actually interferes in multiple different ways, as I'll discuss in a moment. So there is this notion that preprints are somehow dangerous. So one of the ways that preprints are dangerous, of course, is I've already kind of touched on this idea that if you have some unregulated form through which people can just put out information that might compromise, be ethically unsound, that is going to kind of damage the public. And I think that the answer to this is really that preprint servers need to be screening their content carefully in order to avoid these kind of violations. Another kind of notion of danger is this idea that there's already so much information out there that adding more information into the system is going to just break our brains and completely make us unable to process all of this information. I mean, I find this less compelling because we're clearly presenting unpublished data to one another at conferences. Most preprints, at least on the archive, end up as papers, so it's not as though we're completely, increasing the volume. I would argue that we just need better ways of identifying the information that's relevant to us. But I think the whole decision of intending to do a preprint is kind of limited by the fact that so few biologists still know what it is. And so what we are trying to do in order to increase this awareness is to create a network of ambassadors. So these are basically researchers at research institutions who are willing to be contacted to talk about preprints, to share their experience with preprints, and to really kind of be an awareness-raising advocate as they move to different conferences to talk to people about it. I think having a person at your own institution is so much more powerful than just having some random open access advocate come and talk to you. I think it's important that these individual fields and cultures promote their own cultures of preprinting. We also want to bring preprinting sort of out of Twitter and kind of off of the internet. I think the fact that preprints are indexed in Google Scholar, but they're not indexed in PubMed. There's definitely some preprint-specific search engines, PrePubMed being one of them. OSF has a preprint search engine. But in order to really see preprints, you either have to go to the preprint server or go to one of these specific preprint search engines, with the exception of Google Scholar. So even kind of bringing the awareness that preprints are a mode of communication outside of these very specific places. We are working on that. And again, I think that having discussions and really hearing some of these concerns from researchers is been very helpful. So we've been organizing essentially what we call town hall meetings, where if we're in a community, this is one that we did when we were all at the Marine Biological Lab, or MBL, in Woods Hole, trying to have a conversation with colleagues about what are their concerns, really hearing and responding and having an open discussion about preprints, and really not coming into it with a preconceived, I mean, clearly we've had these arguments many times before, but I think the goal is really to have a conversation rather than to sort of proselytize. Another interesting phenomenon that I think is really going to be beneficial toward making preprinting a more known form of communication is the idea of using them for journal clubs. So, at least in my own field, journal clubs are kind of this somewhat nasty way to cut your teeth on critiquing other people's work. So, we'll be like all sitting around in a room and kind of picking apart a figure, saying which controls they should have done, which is, very good training, but also it is in some ways a lot of not only wasted effort, because it's not like our commentary is going to improve the paper, but it's also perhaps a little bit uncivil, in the sense that we're not going to communicate this feedback to authors. We're simply just going to, be impressing one another with our kind of scientific acumen. So Prachi Avasti is one of these ASAPbio ambassadors. She's a professor at the University of Kansas Medical Center, and she's been running her introductory journal club class for graduate students, all using preprints. And they send their comments back to the authors and often hear that it was helpful in improving the paper before it gets finally published. So two other efforts that I just want to mention here. So two other ambassadors are working on a platform called Pre-Review, and Academic Karma also has a listing of preprint journal clubs. But I think one major kind of concern in terms of these kind of behavioral drivers, so what is kind of inhibiting or modulating people's ability to decide or a decision to decide to preprint once they know about it, is the fear of being scooped. So this is, I think, by far the most common concern of early career researchers, so grad students and postdocs, the idea that if they put their work on a preprint server, that their competitors will read it, and not feeling that they have to credit it because it's not a paper. They will take the information either with awareness or maybe not even with awareness and incorporate it into their own paper that they then publish and thereby receive all the credit. Unfortunately, this, I think, can already happen when posting a poster at a meeting. Or when publishing a paper in a journal that has less visibility than the journal that a competitor eventually publishes in. So this is not a unique fear, but it will be alleviated by more eyeballs on preprint servers. I think this notion of scooping preprints is ridiculous to physicists, as I understand it, because to them, the preprint server is the place where new material is, where you go to find new material. Preprint servers have not yet reached that status in the life sciences, but this is going to be there's going to be some kind of this cyclical nature of this change will address that problem over time. I think recognition by funders has really removed a barrier that previously was there, and I think journals are also moving quite along as well. But along this sort of behavioral path, one challenge for young researchers is convincing their PIs that preprinting is a good idea. And so we're basically interested in creating some resources for explaining what the benefits of preprints are. I think it's also very powerful to point to others in the field who are using this and really invite them to kind of contact their peers and get their experience. I think one other challenge in terms of identifying which preprint server to post to is the idea of once this decision has been made, which preprint server, which license will be chosen. And I think having additional choices can be really great. It can enable small fields and small communities to set their own standards that fit them best. So for example, PaleoArchive, which is for a preprint server for paleontology, has basically set up some guidelines that around how new species will be identified, taxonomic names are going to be listed, that is very particular to their field. And it's not something that is a common policy at bioRxiv or archive, but creating these kind of norms is very helpful. But given that there are so many preprint servers, I think one challenge is that how does a researcher know which preprint servers are going to comply with the policies from their potential journals or funders? So for example, Elsevier's policy says that researchers can post to preprints anywhere at any time. Wiley's policy specifies non-commercial servers. Nature's policy says community preprint servers such as arXiv and bioRxiv. Whereas NIH, which has this incredibly thoughtful policy, and no, this is a small clipping of the policy, which is wonderful. These things are actually all encouraged, they're not required, but it is actually really amazing. They also suggest a citation format for preprints, which clearly discloses that it is a preprint. But essentially, there's all of these characteristics, very thoughtful. The fact that content should be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, that there should be policies about plagiarism that are transparent and rigorous, links to the published version, et cetera. There's all of these different considerations, which I think are really something that is actually pretty difficult for researchers to go and find. And I think one other area of confusion, so the NIH policy suggests that let me just read it. They strongly encourage awardees to select a Creative Commons CC BY license or dedicate the work to the public domain, which is, I think, very exciting from the perspective of reuse of preprints, of these preprints being truly open access. This does not necessarily reflect the reality of how people are choosing licenses on bioRxiv today. So this is a breakdown of license choice on bioRxiv. There's the largest licensing choice category is in CC BY and CND, but almost 30% of authors are also selecting no license. So in other words, they grant bioRxiv a license to distribute the article, and also they grant permission to do text and data mining. But really, it's relatively restrictive. And on the other side of this kind of push and pull about licenses, PNAS, until recently, had a policy stating that Creative Commons licenses are not compatible with the license to publish. But they actually removed this language in August. And this is any kind of policies surrounding the preprint license at journals are very rare, but I think that this speaks to a lack of, first of all, a lack of awareness among researchers in general, but also some differences of opinion that we are hoping to reconcile with a task force that we have running right now on preprint licensing. So I think really licensing is just one area among several that are really important, I think, for communities to discuss. So, for example, the question of access to preprints. It's very important to, of course, think about licensing, and that will, of course, impact where preprints can be copied, reused, et cetera. There are definitely some experiments in this space that are requiring registration. So, for example, Cell Press has what is not called a preprint server, but a manuscript under consideration. They're posted on a Mendeley group, which requires users to join the group in order to see the manuscripts. Of course, for any kind of readers or with disabilities, I think that there's a whole question of how formatting is going to be helping them, and of course, formatting is also important for machine access too. The question of preservation of preprints, I think, is really something that is not an immediate concern of a researcher when they're selecting a server, but it is so important. If these things are citable objects, they need to be available in the long term. Metadata and the links to the versions and other records, so incorporation of ORCID numbers, grant numbers, those are, of course, very important to funders, and it's important for, understanding policy, et cetera. And finally, I think one thing that's really important too is this notion of screening and moderation policies. So what is the scope of a preprint server? So for example, the question brought up earlier about Figshare, preprints on Figshare. So essentially, Jordan, in building this graph, is filtering the results on Figshare in order to get the material that he considers to be preprints, which is a small number. But obviously with preprints being in areas that, or on repositories that also have non-preprint content, how are they highlighted? What kind of pre-screening policies are in place? I think this is very important for, as we discussed, medical preprints, having, especially in some of these more kind of sensitive areas, having some community members basically identify what is qualifying as a scientific manuscript and what is not is very important. And finally, policies about removal. So how are manuscripts removed? Is it that failure to secure author permission? Does that constitute removal after this DOI has been posted? Legal concerns, of course, but I think that there's a kind of how is retraction of preprints going to be managed, and what are the different implementations of policy across different servers? So I think the first thing that we would like to do in order to create some clarity, which I think is going to be helping researchers become more comfortable with this notion of preprint servers, and also kind of ensure that the growth of preprints is moving in the right direction, is to provide some sort of transparency of this information. So we've been talking about creating a directory that would enable preprint servers to describe their practices in these various areas. And this would enable researchers, funders, others to compare the practices of preprints and possibly to also overlay some of their own policies onto this resource, which would help researchers choose preprint servers appropriately. So I want to thank the ASAPbio board and say that I look forward very much to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Can you hear me? Yeah. I just had a question about what your view is on the proliferation of lots of different disciplinary servers rather than everybody using one which might be divided up into sections. Because obviously lots of different ones requires adequate cross-searchability and all sorts of other things which we may not actually have yet. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that there's definitely, clearly the physics community has been served well by having a kind of one-stop shop, one place to look. On the other hand, for example, this example of medRxiv, which is really kind of being started by the Yoda project at Yale, they have a really keen understanding of their own field. You can make that argument for almost any of these other kind of disciplinary areas, including paleoarchive, that really it's the researchers themselves who are, I think, best positioned to set the policies of preprints that make sense for communicating amongst themselves. So from that perspective, I agree with you that I think if there is adequate means by which to identify and search these preprints and maybe cross-list these preprints, that could really kind of achieve a lot of this discovery problems. But then, of course, the heterogeneity of policies can create confusion as well. That I think there are certain expectations that would probably make sense across all fields. For example, for content to be, for there to be some sort of minimal metadata, or for content to be preserved. These things, I think, are kind of universal. So.
Hi, I'm Gunther Eisenbach from JMA Publications. I think what you mentioned at the end of your talk about creating a directory of preprint servers, that would be a really good idea. But before we do that, or maybe during we do that, I think there's still a lot of work to do in terms of actually defining what a preprint server is.
Yes.
And come up with a taxonomy. And I noticed that you talked about preprints and preprint servers without trying to define what a preprint really is. But I read on your website, you said something, or whoever wrote that said something about it should be on a public server, right? But I would challenge you on that. I think that there's not this dichotomy between private and public. There's a third way, which is, and you alluded to this, being behind a registration wall, right? And I think in many areas, like medicine, where it would make sense to kind of at least require registration. So, for example, we run a preprint server since 2009. It's called JMA Preprints. The process is that if somebody submits something to our journals, he can opt into open peer review, and then the paper also ends up on this preprint server. But not everybody can see it. They have to register, right? And the purpose is really open peer review, but it's not indexed in Google, for example. It's not findable, which was one of the criteria, and on purpose it's not findable, because we also address the author fears of being scooped, or it's dangerous, etc. All that can be mitigated if you implement some sort of minimum registration policies, right? So, and the reason why I bring this up, like everybody is quoting this graph by Jordan Anaya, showing the growth in preprint servers. So I challenged him. I asked him, why is JMA Preprints not on it? And he said, because it's not open, right? Some people need to register. And I would challenge him and whoever came up with this definition of it must be public to think about whether it should be really public and what the level of publicity should be. Because like originally preprints were intended to facilitate peer review, but not like peer review within a group of experts, right?
So thank you for bringing up this issue, which I think is really interesting and important. I think that, the notion of what constitutes a preprint server is obviously something that needs to be discussed if there's going to be a directory, what gets listed in the directory, and also, what are these kind of areas that we are interested in finding about, and I think different communities have different interests. I think that I would argue that from the perspective of scooping, presenting at a private meeting is actually worse in the sense that there is not this public display of precedents. And I think that public accessibility is important not only for allowing that kind of distribution among all researchers, but really in kind of making sure that this material is not restricted. And so I think this is a conversation that we can definitely have further, because there's clearly multiple purposes being served here. I think one is to make this information as broadly acceptable as possible, but I think that there is some argument that private discussions can kind of help people be more frank with one another. So I think that there's some areas to explore here that are quite interesting. So.
Stephanie Dawson, Science Open. I am interested in the funding model a little bit behind this preprint experiment, because I think it's fantastic and I've been following it closely, but I'm always asking myself, in the long run, if it becomes really big, how are we going to pay for it? I see lots of publishers starting their own preprint servers.
Yeah.
I assume with the idea, okay, we'll be able to skim off a certain amount of that into paying open access APCs. But already we saw from bioRxiv that about 40% of the papers are simply not even really going to be published anywhere. So I'm essentially using it as a publishing service. Mm-hmm. And I also think we have higher and higher expectations of what that content should be able to do. So we want good metadata, we want to be able to text and data mine it, we want it to have licenses that, so we actually want access to that real content right there. So I'm sure you've thought a little bit more about how we're going to pay for that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the value of a preprint is very large relative to its cost. So, for example, on arXiv, the operating budget is about a little over $1 million a year. There's 100,000 preprints posted per year. So, essentially for the arXiv is really doing this, I think, very effectively. $10. I mean, that is an amazing, I think, value for what is being provided. I think that, and clearly arXiv has a very sustainable funding model where libraries and funders together are contributing to this. But I don't think that, so for example, in my own field, researchers pay $75 to submit an abstract to give a poster at a meeting. So I think that there's, while I would be really hesitant for there to be any barriers to posting research at all, I do feel like there is this acknowledgement that researchers are willing to, use some of their research budgets to share their pre-reviewed information on a poster, right? Which I think could be suggest that multiple different business models might actually be sustainable in the long run. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.